When China introduced the one-child policy, they thought they were solving a problem. Decades later, they've realized they created a much bigger one. And now, they're scrambling to fix it.
China is about to make kindergartens, nurseries, free for everyone. And for every child under 3 years old, the government will now give families an annual allowance of 3,600 RMB, about $500. Sounds generous, right? But this isn't just about helping parents. It's about something far more urgent. China is running out of babies. For decades, China controlled population growth with the one-child policy. But now it's desperately trying to reverse course, because today China's biggest economic threat isn't war or tech bans or even the real estate crash. It's demographics. In July 2025, Chinese state media quietly announced two new nationwide initiatives. Number one, free kindergarten and nursery care for all children, a massive expansion of state education. Number two, an annual child benefit of 3,600 RMB for every child under 3 years old, directly paid to guardians. The message is clear: have children and the state will help. It's part of a growing trend of policies aimed at encouraging childbirth, including extended maternity leave, housing incentives, and even matchmaking events, because of course that's also important to making babies. The urgency comes from a stark reality. China's population is shrinking faster than expected. In 2023, China officially reported its first population decline in 60 years. Births dropped to just 9 million, down from over 18 million in 2016. Meanwhile, deaths reached 11 million. Even more worrying, the working age population, those between 15 and 64, is plummeting. In 2010, they made up 74% of the population. And listen to this, by 2025, it's around 68%. By 2050, closer to 60% or less. That means fewer workers, less tax revenue, and more elderly people needing support. Today, over 14% of China's population is over 65. By 2040, that will be 28%, nearly 400 million people. One Chinese official recently said, "We are aging before we get rich." And that's exactly the problem. Many observers are drawing comparisons between China and Japan's population crisis. Japan's population peaked in 2008. Since then, it has been shrinking, and so has its economy. Entire towns have become ghost villages. Schools have shut down. The burden of elderly care has exploded. China, unlike Japan, doesn't have the same level of wealth to absorb this demographic blow. In fact, China will get old before it becomes a high-income country, something Japan managed to avoid. This is what Beijing is desperate to prevent. When I first arrived in China, the one-child policy was still in full effect. That policy didn't just limit family size, it reshaped culture. Entire families, two sets of grandparents and two parents, would pour all their energy, attention and resources into a single child. That child became the emotional and financial centre of the universe, or at least that family's universe. Since then, the government has relaxed the rules. First, couples were allowed to have 2 children, then 3. And now, no cap at all. Have as many children as you like. Government officials were even encouraged to have more children. But simply allowing people to have more children wasn't enough. The one-child era had already engineered a massive cultural shift, and rising costs of living, urban lifestyles and gender roles had solidified it. Some local councils and even private companies started offering cash rewards or property discounts for having babies, and still no baby boom. Eventually, the government dropped another taboo. They legalized childbirth outside of marriage. Now, even unmarried couples can have children with full legal recognition. That was a huge signal of desperation. And why was that such a big deal? Well, before, children born out of wedlock weren't issued a hukou. Now, a hukou is China's household registration system. And without a hukou, a child couldn't register for school, gain access to healthcare, or even legally buy a property later in life. So when the government said, okay, even unmarried couples can now legally have or legitimately have children, it was clear this was no longer just social policy. This was crisis management. So why aren't young Chinese people having babies? It's not that they can't anymore. It's that they don't want to.
那有考虑之后结婚吗？
暂时还没有考虑，因为我们好像都是不婚主，就是觉得有枷锁吧，可能就是爱情就是需要简单一点就可以。
那会想要小孩吗？
不会吧，因为感觉挺有负担的。
结婚之后会想要小孩吗？
怀孕对女性的子宫还有肚子的损伤太大了，
身体伤害太大了，
对对对，
所以说不想要。
In 2023, a survey was done where over 40% of women aged between 18 and 35 said they had no plans at all to have children. 40%. In big cities like Shanghai and Beijing, the birth rate is amongst the lowest in the world, lower than even Japan or South Korea. Here's why. Number one, rising education and job expectations. More women than ever are attending university and entering the workforce. Now, despite everything to do with maternity leave and promises made by big companies and small companies alike, everybody knows maternity leave can affect your career. And careers are being prioritised over child rearing. Number two, cost of living. A single child can cost over 1 million RMB. That's over 140,000 US dollars to raise in urban China. And let's talk about work culture, long hours, high stress, and little flexibility, especially for mothers. Number four, gender expectations. Many young women face pressure to take on traditional caregiving roles, even if they also work full-time. So give you a full-time job, work long hours, work overtime, and also look after their children. I mean, I've seen so many viral posts, these videos on Chinese social media where people below are commenting, how can I afford a baby when I can barely afford to look after myself? The big question is, will these new initiatives work? Well, history suggests probably not. South Korea has the world's lowest fertility rate, despite spending over 200 billion US dollars on pro-birth policies since 2006.
아이를 낳을 때 드는 비용도 있을 거고 비용도 많이 늘었으니까 그런 것도 있지 않을까요?
요새 젊은 층이 자기들을 희생 안 하려고 하고 지금 현재 여가나 그런 것들이 너무 잘 돼 있어서 그런 것들을 되게 즐기고 그게 다 약간 그런 지금을 즐기자 이런 게 너무 강해지고 자기 자신 위주로 그런 삶으로 점점 바뀌면서 그렇게 된 것 같지 않나. 자기 애들을 낳을 바에 그 돈으로 거의 한 몇 억이 든다고 하잖아요. 그래서 그 돈으로 자기 이제 사랑하는 사람이랑 결혼해서 훨씬 더 값어치가 그게 더 높다고 판단해서 그런 게 아닐까요?
일단 코로나 때문에 그동안 결혼을 많이 못해서 그것 때문에 출생률이 낮아지는 건 있다고 생각해요. 지금 문제는 그냥 그 출생률이 낮아진다기보다는 사실 결혼을 안 하는 게 어떻게 보면 이 사회에서 문제라고 생각하는 거겠죠. 결혼한 사람들은 결혼하고 나서 애를 안 낳는다는 선택을 가진 사람은 사실은 극소수예요. 결혼한 사람은 하나나 최소 둘 이상을 낳는단 말이에요, 평균적으로.
그러면 이제 사실 다른 일본이나 중국 같은 아시아 국가에서도 비슷하게 출생률이 감소하는 추세거든요. 그러면 한국 특유의 문제점 같은 거는 어떤 게 있을까요?
말씀하신 것처럼 아시아권 전체가 약간 좀 남들하고 비교 우위로 인해서 행복을 찾는 그런 문화들이 조금 있다라고 생각을 하는데, 아무래도 그런 것 때문에 사실 결혼이라던가 이런 것들에 대해서 좀 남들보다 행복해야만 결혼을 할 수 있는 상황이고 남들하고 비교를 하게 되니까 그냥 전반적으로 동아시아권 자체에서 그런 공통점이 생기지 않나 약간 그런 생각도 드네요. 네.
요새 너무 남녀 갈등이 심해서 약간 그런 영향도 있지 않을까요? 서로 너무 물어뜯는 거를 너무 그게 과열되다 보니까 점점 서로 싫어하게 되고 그러다 보니까 비혼주의도 많아지게 되고.
France saw only modest improvements even with its generous benefits and public daycare. What works tends to be long-term systemic changes. Affordable housing, better work-life balance and gender equality in parenting. And crucially, a cultural shift. Throwing money at parents might help on the margins.
Well, it is a common trend that we're seeing in a lot of industrialized nations. Demographers say that it's due to several reasons, but basically there are the number of women in age of having children is dropping and they're having fewer babies. Why is that? Well, here again, there are several factors. Society is evolving. Basically, there's less pressure to push out the babies, and it's less taboo to just not have children at all. But there's also a lot of other factors. For instance, the rising cost of living and especially uncertainty about the future, whether it's fears of economic hardship ahead or the negative effects of climate change, for instance. All this means that people aren't having kids at all, or they're choosing to have fewer kids.
C'est aussi pour avoir un peu, continuer à avoir du temps pour nous, nos occupations, nos loisirs.
C'est pour ça qu'on a nos carrières aussi respectives, et donc Anna est indépendante, moi je suis salarié dans une grande entreprise. Et un enfant pour nous faisait vraiment sens pour vraiment s'en occuper pleinement.
La conjoncture économique, elle joue un rôle très très important. Avoir des enfants c'est bien, mais bien les éduquer et leur assurer un avenir adéquat, c'est beaucoup plus important.
Of course, a drop in the fertility rate is a concern for the government because there can be real consequences for society, economics.
Absolutely, and it's interesting that this drop comes right as the government is pushing through a controversial overhaul of France's pension system. Now, the government argues that the system is unsustainable because of an aging population combined with a shrinking workforce. And it's true that a lot of France's generous social protection program depends on redistribution. And so if there are fewer babies, well, there'll be fewer workers to pay for the system, unless, of course, we accept more immigrants. But, of course, that is another very controversial debate. Now, on top of all these big societal consequences, there can be very local consequences as well. For instance, some public schools have decided to axe classrooms altogether due to a drop in the number of students, drawing real anger from parents.
On nous promet pour l'année prochaine avec une fermeture de classe et une réaugmentation assez sensible des effectifs.
Nous, ce qu'on demande, c'est de profiter de cette baisse démographique pour proposer un meilleur encadrement et un meilleur suivi.
But it doesn't solve the deep-rooted social pressures facing young Chinese adults. And China is a country like no others. As I've said, we've had decades of the one-child policy. That mindset, the engineering of a one-child nation, well, that takes a while to get used to and change back, reverse, if they can do it at all. Make no mistake, China's birth crisis isn't just about babies. It affects every part of society. The economy, as fewer workers mean slower growth. The pension system, fewer contributors to support more retirees, national defence with shrinking numbers of young military-aged men, and education as schools begin to merge or close entirely. And I've seen that with many friends here in the education system. First the kindergartens, the nurseries, then your elementary, then your secondary. Eventually universities will shut down if there aren't enough people. Xi Jinping has declared fertility a national security issue because if China can't stabilise its population, it risks entering a long period of stagnation, or worse, a decline. China's move to provide free kindergarten, daycare, nursery subsidies may sound generous, and it is generous and it's kind, but behind it all, there's a panic. China used to be the world's most populous country, and of course it's not now, it's India. And no amount of cash can guarantee the one thing the government needs most, and that's hopeful young families willing to bring the next generation into the world. There are two Chinese phrases really popular on social media in China. One is called tanping, which basically means to lie flat. and the other is kun lao, which basically means to live off your parents. Lots and lots of young people and even middle-aged people in cities in China are now tamping and kun lao, lying flat and living off their parents. And for those guys, really, they're not interested in bringing in the next generation. Why would they? They're living a very comfortable, not a very taxing life, and children would complicate that. Guys, if you found this video insightful, interesting, helpful in any way, please do hit the like button and subscribe if you haven't already. And answer this question: what would it take for you to have a child in today's China? Perhaps you've been to China, perhaps you're living in China, let me know. Or in your country, what are the subsidies for having children in your country? Please let me know in the comments below. I can tell you in the UK, for example, every child under the age of 18, so that differs from China, gets money from the government every week, every month, given to the guardians, of course, to ease the burden of looking after children. Guys, that's a wrap. Thank you very, very much for watching. I really do appreciate it. Do hit the like and subscribe button. But from me, Toby's Takeaway, here in China, of course, it's very, very hot here in the summer. That's a wrap. 谢谢，再见，拜拜。